She came to the University of Vermont a few years ago to give a lecture. She was invited by the Gund Institute for Ecological Economics and Sustainability. So she was at her public lecture. It was a big public lecture, and her host asked Alice to give her views on these matters, that is, on ecological economics and sustainability. And she responded that the key issue was jobs, and that people's well-being through employment was key, and sustainability had to accommodate. It wasn't the answer her host was looking for. So, for example, she argued that there has been an overemphasis on poverty alleviation as well as educational investments as the primary drivers of economic development. And she said, and let me quote, "Poverty alleviation has become a cult, but it is no substitute for development. It does not alter structures of the economy and that lead to poverty." And so she argued similarly that education without the simultaneous creation of jobs was equivalent to Say's law. That is, that the assumption that simply by educating people that jobs would appear on their own. And in her own view, that was a deeply flawed view. On a more humorous note, Alice, when she was at the University of Vermont, was talking about her book, The Rise of the Rest, when it came out several years ago. And she said that she had requested that Vladimir Putin endorse the book. It was a little bit unconventional, and alas, Vlad never did respond to her email, but her book was much appreciated anyway. Years ago, there was a classic experiment in psychology, in the psychology of perception, by Gestalt psychologists Jerome Bruner and Leo Postman. And what they did in this experiment is they asked subjects to identify individual playing cards that were briefly flashed before them. And in this deck of cards, they had a few anomalous cards, such as the Black Queen of Hearts. And what they found was that until the exposure time was lengthened considerably, that subjects almost always confidently identified the anomalous cards as normal. And what these researchers argued is that, in fact, people use what they already know to understand things. And that is, it makes us impervious often or blind to what we are actually observing. This thought was carried further by Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolution, who used this example to argue that discoveries in the sciences are in fact relatively rare, and that it's rare because our vision is often obscured. And that is, we only see what we expect to see, that we selectively use real-world data to confirm our prior views and ignore information that does not fit. Such, I would argue, has been the state of development economics, at least since the mid-1970s. And for those of you who are familiar with this, there was a return to the intellectual thought and theoretical framework of Adam Smith, and that is that which argued for the centrality of free markets and limited government for economic growth. And despite the variety of economic structures and external conditions that existed in developing countries in the 1970s and up until today, the mainstream has in particular touted a one-size-fits-all strategy for development, and in particular has been impervious to the facts on the ground of what actually causes development or even the impact of the policies that have been touted. Well, apart from that, today's world is very different from Adam Smith's world of 200 years ago. Today's developing economies come late to the game. They face external conditions very different from those in the time of Adam Smith, and they face in particular stiff competition from the earlier industrializers who dominate the technology frontier. Capital is more mobile, and trade is increasingly no longer just in finished goods, but intra-industry trade. So these conditions, it would appear, have been invisible to most mainstream economists who simply see the experiences of late industrializers as a validation of Adam Smith and David Ricardo's maxims in terms of free markets and free trade. So I would say that, what really characterizes this, and Alice was wont to say this as well, that mainstream development theory has really been developed in an armchair with the help of lots of equations and technical mathematical models, but very little reference to the real world. Well, nothing could have been further than Alice Amsden's method. She was a maverick. She had an extraordinary ability to use the real world as her source of data on which to develop theories of economic development, and she persisted to produce this work even during what I would call the intellectual desert of the 1980s and 90s in terms of development theory. I came to understand the significance of Alice's work during a formative period of my own life when I was working in Haiti in the mid-1980s. I was a master's student running away from the United States and doing an internship for USAID. And my boss at that time, whose name was Jim Walker, would come into my office every couple of days and throw down a cable on my desk from Washington that had been written by Reagan's new, very conservative economists. And these cables would articulate the rapid growth of they would describe the very rapid growth of South Korea and extol the virtues of free trade and free markets that led to this economic growth, and argued, of course, that this should be a role model for all developing countries. So they were there to eliminate all tariffs on imports and exports, and they were pushing Haiti and other poor countries to adopt assembly, manufacturing, production as the strategy for economic growth. Well, this seemed very problematic to me. And it was problematic because primarily what firms were looking for was cheap labor. And there was little or no training. There was no purchase of inputs from the local economy. There was thus no local content. All of the components were imported. The government provided the infrastructure, and workers were earning something like 50 cents a day in dollars at that particular time. So, in other words, it was very little low-paid jobs with no wages. And most importantly for me, in thinking about this, even as sort of a naive master's student, was there seemed no way for the Haitis of the world to escape from the low-wage, low-productivity trap they were in. Any effort of countries that had adopted assembly production to raise the wages of workers led firms to relocate to another country. These were footloose firms, and it meant that, therefore, this type of manufacturing couldn't be the catalyst for the kind of manufacturing experience and structural change that would lead to rapid productivity growth so necessary for economic development. And it is really that nexus, that is, of how to move up the industrial ladder in a world of intense competition with some pretty sophisticated front runners that was really missing in the neoclassical description of how economic development would occur. And in fact, I would argue that development theorists, mainstream development theorists, were blind to at that particular time. And in many ways, I think that there was no connective tissue in their argument that you would have these low-level, footloose industries and somehow spontaneously move up the industrial ladder. There was no description of what the connections were that would in fact raise productivity, particularly in the context of very mobile firms at that particular time. So, as I said, despite these very sophisticated models, there was really no theory of structural change or productivity growth. And so at that time, I knew something was missing from the neoclassical growth model. I wasn't sure what it was. I left Haiti after the election coup and massacre of 1988 and started a PhD program at American University in Washington. And in that next year, Alice published her book, Asia's Next Giant, South Korea and Late Industrialization. And it is really that book that formed my intellectual framework for many years and continues to shape how I see the world. That book in particular highlighted Alice's breadth as an economist. She was a great theorist. Her theory of late industrialization, in my view, is unrivaled in the field of economic development, both for its breadth and its intricacy. She was also a great economic historian. To formulate the theory of late industrialization, one had to understand how this period differs from earlier periods of economic growth, and in particular, and in that regard, what Alice understood was that context matters, that external conditions matter, that the state of the global economy matters, and that therefore the strategy for development is context-specific and historically specific and structurally specific. There is no one-size-fits-all development strategy, unlike what had been touted and continues to be touted by the Washington Consensus. So Alice knew that what needed to happen was that structural change was necessary to move from the production of primary goods, labor-intensive goods, to goods that required knowledge-intensive assets. And that this required a very different set of tools than earlier industrializers had utilized. So I want to say a few words about her methodology, which people don't often talk about, but I think is very relevant and important. I think it's important for us because those of us who are training the next generation of economists, I think it's important for us to pay attention to the methodology of Alice that was, in fact, so fundamental to her insights. And let me just say this, it was really relatively straightforward, and that is her methodology was fieldwork, talking to people about whom she was theorizing, talking to people, to industries, to government officials, to industrialists in specific sectors of the economy in dozens of developing countries. Alice could talk to you about the specific banks and industries and sectors in numerous middle-income and late industrialized economies. And when Alice was giving you advice, Alice wouldn't say, you should read Kaldor or you should read Hirschman. She would say, you should look at what Brazil's doing. You should look at what Mexico is doing. You should look at what China is doing. And so, in fact, her quantitative approach was largely the use of extensive descriptive data for verifying her hypotheses and claims. In fact, I have read just about everything that Alice has written, and I have never found a mathematical model. I may have found one or two equations, and I don't think I ever saw any regressions that she ran. And she showed with this that one does not have to be highly mathematically technical in order to be a great thinker. This isn't to eschew the usefulness of quantitative methods in economics. Indeed, many of us, including myself, have used those tools to test Alice's hypotheses. In terms of methodology, Alice was very similar to that of fellow economist Barbara Bergman. Barbara is now 88 years old. She was the first woman to get a PhD in economics from Harvard University and was on the Council of Economic Advisors with John F. Kennedy. Both of them were feisty women. Both had acerbic commentary on the mainstream, and both, I think, were shaped by studying and becoming economists in a very male-dominated profession. They knew each other. They didn't interact very much, but I imagine that they nevertheless would have reveled in the real-world approach to economics that the other took, had they spent any time together. Both had a penchant for world economics and basically talking to people as a way to gather data to understand how economies work and grow. So I wanted to just share with you a quote from Barbara Bergman. The impoverished factual content of our thought doesn't embarrass us economists. We're used to it. But it is somewhat embarrassing to explain explicitly to non-economists that we find things out by sitting and thinking and mulling over a few factual crumbs, and that the systematic first-hand observation of economic functioning has no place whatsoever in economics. And that's why I point to Alice as being a person who has made visible what heretofore had been invisible, because in many cases, economists have failed to look at the real world as a way to understand how economies function. So central to Alice's theory of late industrialization, based on the experience of numerous countries, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, China, and Brazil, to name just a few, was that growth and rising living standards depend primarily on increasing productivity. Her goal was to identify how firms could shift from primary commodity production to the production of more sophisticated goods using knowledge-based assets. And what she argued was that in particular, this trajectory required manufacturing experience. And this in turn requires something very specific for late industrializers, and that is the ability to borrow and apply technical knowledge. Because these countries are not at the technological frontier, they could not hope to produce the new technology. What they could hope to do was to efficiently borrow it, adapt it, and utilize it, and move to the front themselves. So as Alice, one of the most fascinating parts of Alice's work, I think, was her description of how countries and how the governments help national enterprises adopt technology and learn. And what she argued is that borrowing and applying frontier technology is not easy. It requires several ingredients. First of all, you have to purchase or license best practice technologies, and in order to do that, you have to earn foreign exchange. So you have to be able to export in order to generate the foreign exchange to purchase. Second of all, you need practice, and that is productivity rises. Productivity isn't born, it rises as a result of experience in producing, or what Kaldor called learning by doing. And so what this means is that it required consumer demand, domestic demand, and of course export demand. Helping, and what that required was import barriers and export subsidies in order to give firms, national firms in particular, the experience they needed to learn over time. And of course, because costs had to be kept low in order to successfully export, and profits would have had to have been razor thin in order to do that, and firms would therefore have been unlikely to be willing to export. What was required was ways to incentivize firms to move into these industries, to help boost their profits in order to get them into these industries, and then subsidies so that they would be competitive in order to export and get experience. So one might argue, and certainly there's a common argument these days by the World Bank, but in a number of countries, and that is that one way to get that experience is to repress wages. This certainly was the argument in Haiti at that period of time, and subsequently in many countries. And that is the idea that governments should discipline labor or make labor markets more flexible. So basically, by lowering labor costs, you can reduce the price of exports, you can generate foreign exchange, and get practice, and therefore raise productivity growth. But Alice, and I think that this is one of the areas of Alice's work that has received less attention than it deserves, and that is that Alice argued that this is a flawed strategy for late industrialization. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of why she said that with regard to the experience of South Korea. She argued first, it's true that if you lower wages, export prices would fall. But late industrializers are so far behind developed economies that wages would have to fall a lot in order for firms to be competitive. And moreover, wage cuts are no guarantee that skills will rise or that total costs will fall, and in the long run, she argued, falling wages in poor countries are no match for rising productivity in the rich ones. So what she had to say about wages was fundamentally important in my view. And in particular, she argued that if you lower wages in late industrialized countries, what you do rather than gain competitiveness is lose competitiveness because you lower productivity. And why is that the case? Well, once again, let me refer to the example of South Korea, in which she argued that late industrialization requires the application, the borrowing and application of technology, and that fundamentally happens on the shop floor. It does not happen in the engineer's office. It literally happens as workers adopt and practice new technologies, change production processes, and therefore raise their productivity. So workers' intelligence is a fundamental component of late industrialization. And so she argued, that even if you bought a factory or a turnkey factory or a patent or a blueprint, that the knowledge about how this worked was not codified. It was tacit knowledge, and you needed the cooperation of workers to do that. And higher wages were the incentive for workers to exercise their intelligence on the job, as she put it. It also meant that workers were more loyal, that turnover was lower, and it meant that investments in workers' skills were retained by the firm, and the firms benefited from this. So I think this is an important lesson that Alice shares about how the actual micro-level framework in which productivity rises and the role of labor in that particular process. So what she argued then was actually that higher wages, not lower wages, are needed to stimulate productivity growth and structural change. And she argued that in South Korea, in fact, that it was rapid productivity growth was in fact due to rapidly rising wages. This, in fact, was the topic of my dissertation, and that was that I wanted to test Alice's hypothesis, and that is that I developed a macro model that looked at the impact of wages on growth, and the question was South Korean growth wage-led? Did wages lead, and was there evidence that wages stimulated productivity growth to create a virtuous cycle? And the answer to that was yes. I would be wrong, however, if I fail to mention that there was something else that I discovered in this work that Alice and I have talked about and debated a few times, and that is that there were low-wage workers in the Korean economy, and they were women who were segregated into labor-intensive export industries through a variety of cultural and social norms that led them to be perceived as secondary wage workers that could be expelled when there was a shortage of demand, reabsorbed when there was a need for them. And so what you saw, what I think Haiti was actually was a dual sector economy with men segregated in capital-intensive industries, export industries, and the non-tradable industries, and women in these labor-intensive industries. And some work that I have done suggests there's evidence that women's low wages in these export industries generated the foreign exchange to purchase foreign technologies or borrowed technologies that were then used by capital-intensive industries, and in fact had a strong positive effect on economic growth in South Korea. Alice and I talked about this, in fact, the first year that we were at APORD together, and she radically disagreed with me, but we agreed to agree on the following, and that is that low wages were a stimulus to growth in South Korea. Low female wages were a stimulus to growth, but they certainly were not sufficient to promote growth in South Korea. Much more was needed in the way of policy. So the question then might be, what policy tools could be used to incentivize national firms to move into industries in which they had no experience and were therefore unable to compete, neither nationally nor in foreign markets? Well, Alice argued that what you needed to do was to use policy tools to create rents, that is excess profits, and to socialize the investment risk of national firms to move into strategic industries that would raise economy-wide productivity. So the state artificially raised profits by subsidies, by import controls, and giving some firms import licenses so that they could earn super profits on protected import goods, lower cost energy, subsidized credit, and so forth. And of course, it promised to bail out large firms in the event that they face difficulties. So the challenge, of course, that Alice has underscored, that has been so pivotal to understanding the success stories of late industrialization, is that while subsidies generate rents, there's no guarantee that those rents would be invested in ways that raise productivity. And so strategies are needed to make sure that firms take what I call the high road. That is, that they align their profit interests with the broader interests of society. Unlike in Haiti, for example, where the major firms and the large families in the export industries in Haiti were given all kinds of perks, import licenses and so forth, and they primarily used that money to go shopping in Miami and Paris and to import BMWs. But it was never reinvested back in the Haitian economy to raise productivity. And so here is where Alice argued that late industrializers differed from other governments, and that is that these governments to various degrees use tools at their disposal to discipline capital as well as labor. And I think that has been a very missing part of the story of economic growth. There is a broad sense in the mainstream that somehow multinational firms and even large national firms somehow do not need to be disciplined. And I think it is because many neoclassical economists continue to be under the sway of the notion that markets are competitive. Indeed, when roughly 88% of markets globally are considered monopsonistic, or at least not competitive. In any case, the case of South Korea is the most stark. It was the one I spent a lot of time researching, and the state used what Alice called reciprocal control mechanisms. And there was basically a carrot and stick approach, and in many ways it was very effective. The large conglomerates were given a variety of subsidies that I've just described to you. They were then required to invest a particular portion of their profits in strategic industries, and within a given time period, they were required to export a certain percentage of their production. Every month, they met with the Ministry of Trade and Industries, and they had to report on how they were doing in meeting their investment targets and their export targets. If they were running into problems, the government worked with them to identify what those problems were, but they also knew that the stick was available, and that the stick was that the subsidies would be withdrawn and any of the subsidized credit would be withdrawn and so forth. In other words, that these firms were held accountable. If they failed, they lost access to the prized benefits that led to their rents. So Alice then identified, based on observation, based on in-depth interviews with policymakers, with industrialists in middle-income countries, a deep understanding of what it took to move up the industrial ladder. And it took, in particular, a complex role for the government in late industrialized economies. And let me just summarize what those were. The state first has to be able to identify strategic industries whose development can lead to structural change and economy-wide productivity growth. It then has to allocate subsidies and resources to firms that invest in those industries in order to promote rents and reduce risk. It then has to monitor performance without getting too cozy with economic elites. And finally, of course, it must produce the public goods needed that firms needed to thrive: education, publicly funded research and development, and infrastructure. In a word, what was needed, or rather two words, was industrial policy. It is perhaps these insights on the role of the state that made Alice's work so unacceptable to the mainstream. They could not countenance that there would be such an important role for the state, and they sought to disprove her at every turn. I want to just give you one example of this, and that was her work on East Asia. The World Bank, when Alice's book Asia's Next Giant came out, they argued that South Korea actually hadn't succeeded because of state-led development and getting what Alice called getting prices wrong, but rather they argued that it was because the state, after the 1980s, had begun to liberalize trade and investment. And in other words, they argued again that it was free trade that was the cause of South Korea's rapid economic success. Alice responded in her inimitable way that trade liberalization was just that. It was just talk. And instead she retorted, and I quote, "To assess the degree of openness in South Korea after liberalization is as hard as assessing the degree of godliness in a reformed heretic." In other words, what the South Korean state said and what it did were in fact two very different things. And she was very clear, pointing out where they in fact did not adhere to what they were saying about opening trade. I want to turn to another topic that Alice had a lot to say about, and that is the role of foreign multinationals. I think there continues to be a dominant sense that foreign direct investment is the primary mechanism by which developing countries will raise their productivity, because it is these multinationals that will bring in best practice technology and bring competition to domestic firms, and therefore that investment should be liberalized. Alice had a very skeptical view of foreign direct investment, and she argued that foreign-owned firms were, as she put it, bureaucratic dinosaurs. They operated bureaucratically. They could stymie productivity growth rather than enhancing productivity growth, a view that was considered heresy, and to my mind probably is still considered heresy in some quarters. She said, in fact, it should not matter whether a firm is nationally owned or foreign owned in a perfectly competitive world, but this is not a perfectly competitive world. And she recognized that foreign firms had monopolistic power, and that when they produced abroad, they often produced with inferior technology. They did not want to let out their knowledge-based assets, and so they almost always produced with technology that was not at the frontier. They abused transfer pricing. They had high import content of production, and they interfered politically to improve their profit margins. And in particular, she said they were risk averse. In fact, they took on and continue to often take on only safe investments abroad. They're likely to invest in resource extraction, primary goods and services, but not in technologically dynamic sectors. So she argued that foreign-owned firms squelched rather than stimulated learning at the local level. And in fact, most of their R&D, they kept at home precisely because it was a proprietary good that they wanted to protect. So she again referred to South Korea as an example of a country that avoided foreign direct investment successfully. In fact, she argued that barring foreign direct investment was key to South Korea's economic growth. So let me just say a few words about this. It is indeed true that South Korea banned foreign direct investment for many years. In the 1980s, in the late 1970s, the early 1980s, the government was moving into electronics, didn't know how to do it. They decided that they were going to invite in foreign firms to help get the technology and the know-how to do this, but they only invited them in as joint ventures. After several years, so joint ventures with national firms. After national firms had learned enough, they invited the foreign-owned firms to leave. And these joint-owned firms were, in fact, disbanded and barred. So what that meant was that developed national entrepreneurial talent, but also this is fundamentally important to the growth in particular of South Korea, that national-owned firms that were getting subsidies, that were getting subsidized credit and so forth, could be disciplined. Foreign firms could not be disciplined to invest in target industries and to do the kinds of things that the South Korean government wanted. And so that was one of the mechanisms that South Korea used to, in fact, lead development. And if you compare that to countries like Singapore, which had relied heavily on foreign direct investment, and in which foreign-owned firms displaced national firms, then you might begin to see the world the way that Alice did. And in fact, I was very intrigued by this particular notion, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the foreign-owned firms really dominated in manufacturing in Singapore, and the domestic firms withered away. They became very inconsequential in the manufacturing sector. So in 1985, the Singaporean government was concerned that productivity growth was not rising very rapidly. These were not very dynamic firms. So they decided that the way that they would induce foreign firms to raise their productivity was to raise wages, thinking that firms would be squeezed and they would be forced to innovate and adopt new processes. What do you imagine these firms did? Well, they just moved to another country. And in fact, that led to the decline of the Singaporean industry. But what I noticed and what I remarked upon was that if you looked at not only was productivity growth slower in Singapore with so much foreign direct investment as compared to South Korea with virtually none, if you look at the period in which there has been investment liberalization, roughly from the 1980s onward, what you find is that in middle-income countries, productivity growth had slowed dramatically. So I actually went on to do some research on this, and in particular, I had a hypothesis, and that hypothesis was that in countries that had a high degree of foreign direct investment, where firms are mobile, that wage growth will be slower than in countries where FDI is a smaller share of total investment. And why is that? Because when firms are mobile, it presents a threat effect to workers. Workers recognize that if they try to raise their wages, that firms will relocate. This is true not just in developing countries, but was also true in the United States when the NAFTA agreement was passed. And so what that meant was that wage growth would slow as a result of a larger share of foreign direct investment as a percentage of total investment in an economy. And my argument was the following, that as globalization has continued and investment and production has become much more uncertain, firms would seek sources of cheap labor as a way to attain competitiveness rather than the riskier investment in production and process innovation. And so they essentially, one might argue that firm mobility would make firms lazy, that they would rely instead on low wages as a way to gain competitiveness rather than other ways that would raise productivity in terms of product and process innovation. So I tested this hypothesis, and I looked at roughly 25 semi-industrialized economies, because these are the countries where this dynamic plays out, essentially late industrialized economies. And what I found first was that the larger the share of foreign direct investment, both inward and outward foreign direct investment, because it's the mobility of firms that matters for the threat effect, that in fact wage growth was lower than in those firms that had a lower share of FDI in investment. And moreover, that productivity growth was slower as a result. My results confirmed Alice's concern that foreign-owned firms were dead weight and that the cultivation of national entrepreneurial talent is key to economic development. As I said, her theory of late industrialization came at a time when development economics was under the shadow of an increasingly rigid free market, free trade development theory. 25 years after the publication of Asia's Next Giant, however, market reforms are now widely perceived as having gone erroneously too far in reducing the role of the state in the economy to the detriment of economic growth. The crisis in 2008 has called into further question the salutary effects of liberalization of markets, trade, and investment, precisely in the countries that are the architects of the Washington Consensus. There is now an increased willingness to consider the expanded role of the state, but there is still little appetite for what I would call Amsdenomics, or getting prices wrong. I will say that there is nevertheless a growing discussion, for example, of industrial policy, even at institutions such as the World Bank. And I think that what this speaks to is the importance of Alice's work, the ratification of her work, and in particular, the fact that those countries that have exhibited exceptional growth in recent years are Asian economies such as China, which have pursued Amsdenomics, as I like to call it, as well as those countries in the 2000s that have been pulled along by the product demand that has been stimulated by Chinese growth. And indeed, it is remarkable that state-led growth economies have continued to expand despite the malaise in rich countries. For this, and because of the dismal performance of globalization policies, Alice's work is highly relevant. I predict that her work will be influential in the future as the stagnation of the Great Recession of 2008 continues in the rich countries. I want to offer you another quote by another famous economist. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, The actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. Words that Alice would agree with, not one of her favorite economists. But let me say this, that our greatest tribute to Alice will be to keep her ideas alive and to extend them so that someday, perhaps even in our lifetime, they become the mainstream and indeed politically inevitable. Alice represents the Black Queen of Hearts, the anomalous one in a deck of cards. Unlike other economists who are prone to see what their theoretical blinders expect them to see, Alice made visible what had remained invisible to others, and for this, we owe her a huge intellectual debt. Thank you.